Grantley Hall was the perfect stage for tragedy. An Art Deco masterpiece in the Devon Hills, its mahogany panelling glowed under crystal chandeliers. Velvet curtains framed views of rain-lashed terraces, and the air carried the scent of hothouse lilies mixed with Cuban cigar smoke. Every guest played their part in this weekend of triumph, the return of the Finch expedition from Yucatan with the fabled calendar stone. Then Professor Alistair Finch was found dead in the library, throat opened by an ancient obsidian blade, the stone itself beside him like a silent chorus. Police saw suicide, perhaps the curse he had laughed about at dinner. But Hercule Poirot saw a performance. Someone in this theatre of empires and ambition was playing the role of the innocent, the role of the murderer. Chapter 1. The stage is set. Rain lashed the tall leaded windows of Grantley Hall, like an impatient audience demanding the show begin. The storm had started just after midnight. And now, at 2 o'clock, the grandfather clock in the great hall sent its deep, measured chimes rolling through the corridors. The scent of fresh furniture wax mingled with dying cigar smoke, and the heavy sweetness of hothouse lilies arranged in tall crystal vases. Lady Beatrice Grantley was the first to discover the horror. She had come down from her room in a midnight blue silk evening gown that rustled with every hurried step across the polished parquet. The sound cut sharply against the low crackle of the drawing-room fire, which had burned down to glowing embers. She pushed open the library door and froze. Professor Alistair Finch lay sprawled across his own mahogany desk. His head had fallen forward, resting almost gently on an open notebook filled with penciled glyphs. Blood had soaked into the blotter and dripped in slow, dark rivulets to the Persian rug below. The murder weapon, an obsidian blade, black and razor-sharp, one of the expedition's most prized finds, remained embedded in the side of his throat. Beside the body sat the calendar stone itself, a massive limestone disc, 3 feet across, its intricate carvings catching the flicker of the single desk lamp. The stone seemed to watch, impassive. Lady Beatrice gave one short, perfect scream, high, controlled, exactly the pitch one might rehearse for dramatic effect, then swayed and collapsed in a graceful faint onto the nearest velvet chaise. Her silk gown pooled around her like spilled ink. The household converged within moments. Sir Charles Grantley, the host and financier of the expedition, appeared first. He stood rigid in his burgundy velvet smoking jacket, face ashen beneath the soft tinkling of the crystal chandelier overhead. His hands remained clasped behind his back, knuckles white. Dr. Marcus Bellamy, the expedition's epigrapher, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with fingers that betrayed no tremor. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, but his voice held the calm of a man reading a lecture script. Miss Harriet Voss, Finch's young research assistant, clutched a half-empty crystal flute of champagne. The golden liquid trembled in the glass, yet her voice stayed level when she spoke. He was alive an hour ago. Mr. Julian Hargrove, the expedition photographer, he lingered near the cold marble fireplace. He still wore his kid gloves, as though the night remained a formal reception rather than a crime scene. A leather camera case rested at his feet like a faithful dog. Mrs. Eleanor Thorpe, Finch's widowed sister and trustee of the family collection, poured herself a fresh cup of strong continental coffee from the silver pot on the sideboard. The rich, bitter aroma cut through the chill that had crept in from the open terrace doors. "Someone must telephone the police," she said briskly, though her eyes never left the body. Hercule Poirot had been a guest of honour that weekend, invited not for his knowledge of Mayan glyphs, but for his reputation and his almost pathological love of order and method. He now stood quietly in the library doorway, small, neat hands clasped before him, the egg-shaped head tilted slightly to one side. His green eyes gleamed with the quiet satisfaction of a director who has just watched the opening tableau fall perfectly into place. He stepped forward, shoes making soft clicks on the parquet. The room smelled now of blood, coppery and warm, mingling with the furniture wax, the lilies, the faint trace of Lady Beatrice's Chanel perfume, and the lingering smoke of Sir Charles's last cigar. Poirot circled the desk slowly, careful not to disturb the scene. He noted the position of the blade, driven in with force, but at a slightly awkward angle, as though the killer had stood behind and slightly to the right of the seated victim. He noted the absence of struggle, no overturned chair, no scattered papers beyond the notebook, no defensive wounds on the hands. He noted, too, the calendar stone itself. Its surface bore the familiar interlocking wheels of days and years, but one small section near the bottom edge looked freshly chiselled. A crude modern addition, a single glyph that did not belong. He touched his magnificent moustache thoughtfully with one finger. "Observe, mes amis," he said softly, though he spoke as much to the invisible audience in his mind as to the people in the room. "This is no accident of passion. This is theatre. The blade chosen for symbolism, the stone placed as scenery, the body arranged just so. Someone has directed this scene with care." He turned his gaze on each face in turn. Lady Beatrice, now recovered and sitting upright, dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Dr. Bellamy, spectacles glinting, maintained perfect scholarly composure. Miss Voss, champagne flute still in hand, avoided looking directly at the wound. Mr. Hargrove flexed gloved fingers once, twice. Mrs. Thorpe sipped her coffee, the cup steady. Poirot made a small expressive gesture with his hands. "You watch with Poirot, no? You see how each one plays their role already. The grieving widow, the shocked colleague, the loyal assistant, the helpful outsider, the practical relative, but watch carefully. Truth does not rehearse. Lies flow smooth, too smooth." He straightened, drawing himself up to his full, still modest height. "The stage is set," he announced quietly. "The actors have taken their places. Let the drama begin." Chapter 2. Enter the player's morning light filtered through the heavy silk curtains of the morning room, turning the polished parquet floor into a pattern of pale gold and shadow. The storm had passed, and now only a soft drizzle tapped against the tall windows, like fingers testing whether the performance might resume. Inside, the air still carried the faint metallic memory of last night's blood, though someone had opened the terrace doors to let in the clean, chill scent of wet earth and box hedge. Hercule Poirot had requested that each member of the household be interviewed separately here, in this smaller, more intimate space. A low fire crackled in the grate, sending warmth against the cool marble surround. On the side table stood a silver coffee pot, steam curling upward with the rich, continental aroma that cut through everything else. Crystal glasses from the previous evening still held the last shallow pools of champagne. No one had yet cleared them away. Poirot sat in a high-backed chair, upholstered in deep green velvet, his small hands resting symmetrically on the arms. Before him, on a low occasional table, he had arranged 3 objects with meticulous care: his own fountain pen, a clean white handkerchief, and an empty ashtray. Order and method, always. Lady Beatrice Grantley entered first. She had changed into a simple charcoal day dress of soft wool, but the silk scarf at her throat still carried a whisper of Chanel. She seated herself opposite Poirot, with the grace of someone accustomed to being watched. "I cannot believe he is gone," she began, voice low and musical. She produced a lace handkerchief and pressed it briefly to the corner of each eye. Alistair was everything. The expedition, the stone, this house, it was all for him. Her shoulders gave a small, controlled shudder. Poirot tilted his egg-shaped head. "You discovered the body, madame. At what hour precisely did you descend to the library?" "Shortly after 2. I could not sleep. The storm—" She trailed off, dabbing again. The handkerchief remained pristine. "Observe, mon ami," Poirot murmured as though speaking to an invisible companion at his shoulder. "The performance of grief is technically perfect. The shoulders shake appropriately. The voice catches at exactly the right moments. But the handkerchief, it stays quite dry. No mascara runs. No redness at the rims of the eyes. You watch with Poirot, no? You see how perfectly the role is played?" Lady Beatrice lowered the handkerchief. "I beg your pardon?" Poirot made a small, expressive gesture. "Nothing, madam. Continue, if you please." She spoke of their marriage, of Finch's obsession with the calendar stone, of how he had become distant in recent weeks. Poirot listened, nodding, his green eyes never leaving her face. Next came Dr. Marcus Bellamy. The epigrapher entered briskly, spectacles catching the firelight. He wore a well-cut tweed jacket, rough against the smooth kid gloves he still carried in one hand. "A tragedy for scholarship," he said at once, seating himself without invitation. "Finch was on the verge of a major breakthrough. That new glyph on the stone, it changes everything." Poirot smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from his sleeve. "You were working late last night, I believe." "In the study adjoining the library, translating field notes. I heard nothing until Lady Beatrice screamed." "And you did not enter the library at any point after midnight?" "Certainly not." Bellamy's voice remained level. His fingers rested calmly on the arm of the chair. "Ah," said Poirot softly. "Ah, the hands, they do not tremble. Not even a little. A man who has just learned of his colleague's murder might be expected to show something. But you, Doctor, you are admirably composed." Bellamy adjusted his spectacles. "I have seen violent death before. Yucatan is not always kind to archaeologists." Poirot inclined his head. "Mais oui. One becomes accustomed, or perhaps one rehearses composure." Miss Harriet Voss followed. She wore a plain navy skirt and cardigan, yet her fingers kept twisting the hem of the cardigan, as though it were stage costume she could not quite shed. She accepted coffee from Poirot's hand. The cup rattled faintly against the saucer. "He promised me co-authorship on the final paper," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "The new inscription. It was my reading that unlocked the lunar series. And now—" Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "You were devoted to Professor Finch?" "Completely." She looked down at her lap. "He was brilliant. Difficult, yes, but brilliant. And when he told you, perhaps, that the credit would remain his alone?" She started. "He never said that." Poirot made no reply, only watched as her fingers tightened on the saucer until the porcelain clicked. Mr. Julian Hargrove came next, bringing with him the faint smell of photographic chemicals and damp leather. He set his camera case carefully beside the chair before sitting. "I was developing plates in the darkroom until 1:30, he explained, documenting the stone from every angle. When I came out, the house was quiet. I went straight to bed." Poirot touched his magnificent moustache thoughtfully. You wear gloves even now, monsieur. Indoors. Why?" Hargrove glanced down as though surprised to find them still on. "Habit. Chemicals. Fingerprints on negatives are disastrous." "Or on other things," Poirot murmured. "You photographed everything you say. Did you photograph the calendar stone after midnight?" "No, earlier in the evening." "Pity. A photograph of the final position might have been illuminating." Hargrove met Poirot's gaze steadily. "I wish I had." Mrs. Eleanor Thorpe was last. She entered carrying her own coffee cup, the dark liquid still steaming. She wore a tailored tweed suit, practical yet expensive, and her sandalwood cologne drifted across the small space between them. "One must be practical at a time like this," she said without preamble. "The collection must be secured. The stone itself is worth a fortune on the legitimate market, more on the other. Alistair never understood money." Poirot arranged the fountain pen parallel to the edge of the table. "You disapproved of your brother's methods?" "I disapproved of waste. He threw money at expeditions while the family trust dwindled. And now that he is gone—" She sipped her coffee. "Now the trust can be managed sensibly." Poirot studied her for a long moment. "Madame, you pour coffee with a hand that does not shake. You speak of money with calm. Yet your brother lies dead by an obsidian blade from his own collection. Does this not disturb you?" "Disturbance changes nothing," she replied. "One performs one's duty." Poirot rose slowly. "Merci. You have all been most cooperative." He stood at the window, watching raindrops trace slow paths down the glass, and while the fire snapped behind him. The players had entered the stage. Each had spoken their opening lines, assumed their postures, arranged their expressions. Some performances were polished, some strained at the edges. But already, in the small hesitations, the two steady hands, the dry handkerchiefs, the little grey cells had begun their quiet work. Every actor had taken their mark. But who played truth, and who played lies? Chapter 3. The First Act. By late morning the drizzle had stopped, leaving the terrace outside the morning room slick and gleaming under a weak sun. Inside, the grandfather clock in the hall struck 11. Each chime seemed to mark another step deeper into the performance. The scent of fresh coffee still hung in the air, now joined by the faint, acrid trace of photographic developing fluid that clung to Mr. Hargrove's jacket when he passed through the corridor earlier. Hercule Poirot had requested the household remain within the house. No one was to leave Grantley Hall until the local inspector arrived from Exeter, expected some time after luncheon. In the meantime, Poirot moved through the rooms like a director inspecting his set, small hands clasped behind his back, green eyes missing nothing. He began in the library once more. The body had been covered with a sheet of crisp white linen, the obsidian blade removed and placed in a glass case on a side table for the police. The calendar stone remained exactly where it had been found, beside the desk, its carved surface lit now by daylight streaming through the tall windows. Poirot crouched beside it, tilting his egg-shaped head, and there, near the bottom rim, almost hidden among the interlocking wheels of days and cartoons, a single glyph had been added. Crude, fresh chisel marks still showed white against the weathered limestone. The symbol did not match any known Mayan form. It was a clumsy modern imitation of the death sign, the one that appeared in tourist guides rather than scholarly texts. And beneath it, in tiny scratched letters visible only on close inspection, "Full moon claims its due." Poirot straightened slowly. "The little grey cells," he murmured. "They begin to speak." He summoned Dr. Bellamy first. The epigrapher arrived promptly, spectacles gleaming, tweed jacket buttoned as though for a lecture hall, rather than a house under suspicion. "You noticed this addition to the stone, of course?" Poirot asked without preamble, gesturing to the fresh glyph. Bellamy bent forward, peered, then gave a short, sharp intake of breath. "Impossible! This is forgery, amateurish, hasty. Alistair would have spotted it at once." "Yet he did not mention it to anyone," Poirot observed. "Not at dinner, not in the drawing-room afterward. Why, do you suppose?" Bellamy reached instinctively toward the inner pocket of his jacket, for his cigarette case, Poirot noted. The hand moved smoothly, without hesitation. The case came out. A cigarette was selected and lit with fingers that held the match rock steady. Poirot watched the small flame reflect in the spectacles. "Observe, mon ami, this suspect plays his role too perfectly. Shock should make the hand tremble. A cigarette should be fumbled. But here, nothing, steady as a lecturer pointing at a blackboard." Bellamy exhaled smoke in a thin stream. "I have trained myself to composure. Years in the field, snakes, scorpions, bandits. One learns control." "Mais oui," Poirot said softly. "Control, or rehearsal." He dismissed Bellamy and called for Miss Voss. She entered hesitantly, navy cardigan sleeves pulled down over her hands as though to hide something. She stood before the calendar stone, eyes fixed on the new glyph. "I saw it yesterday afternoon," she whispered, "when we unpacked the crates. Professor Finch laughed, called it a joke, said some local guide must have added it for tourists before we acquired the piece. And last night, I didn't look closely again." Poirot tilted his head. "Your devotion to the professor was complete, non? You read the Lunar series when no one else could." She nodded, assured, for eyes brightening for a moment with something close to pride. Then the light vanished. "He promised me recognition. Then he said the paper would carry only his name." The mask slipped, just for a second. Her mouth tightened. Her fingers curled into fists inside the cardigan sleeves. Poirot made no comment. He merely arranged 3 pencils on the desk in perfect alignment. "I'm reminded of the affair at Luxor, many years ago. A certain antiquities dealer performed scholarly indignation with such artistry that even the museum directors believed him innocent of forging a scarab. He had practiced before mirrors. The widening eyes, the trembling voice, the dramatic gesture of denial. Yet, when confronted with the genuine piece placed beside his fake, he reached for his monocle with fingers that never shook. A truly outraged man clutches at his collar, at his heart, at anything within reach. The body betrays what the rehearsed face attempts to conceal. This is what the little grey cells comprehend. The psychology that lives beneath the performance, invisible to those who see only the surface. Therefore, Dr. Bellamy knew of this forgery before Poirot drew attention to it. His reach for the cigarette case was too smooth, too prepared. His shock is costume, not emotion. You see it now, non? The theatre begins to crumble. Later, Poirot stood alone on the terrace. The air was cold, carrying the clean smell of rain-soaked grass and distant wood smoke from the estate cottages. He smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from his sleeve and considered the cast. Lady Beatrice continued to play the grieving widow, silk scarf replaced by black velvet, a handkerchief always at hand, yet always dry. Dr. Bellamy maintained the role of the composed scholar. Steady hands measured words. Miss Voss performed the betrayed assistant. Soft voice, downcast eyes, yet flashes of something harder beneath. Mr. Hargrove stayed the helpful outsider, gloves on, camera case never far away. Mrs. Thorpe enacted cool practicality, coffee cup in hand, sandalwood cologne sharp against the chill. Each performance had its polish, each had its tiny flaw. Humans wear masks, mes amis, because naked faces are rarely applauded. We dress greed in the robes of grief, fear in the cloak of calm, resentment in the costume of loyalty. Society hands us the scripts: widow, colleague, assistant, friend, sister. We learn the lines, we rehearse the gestures. We fear the moment the spotlight reveals the trembling hand, the dry eye, and the too perfect composure. Yet every actor eventually forgets a line. The body remembers what the mind tries to erase. Guilt whispers through the fingers, through the breath, through the momentary tightening of a jaw. Truth does not need rehearsal. It stumbles, it hesitates, it bleeds real tears when it must. Lies flow smooth, until they do not. The first act had concluded. Some masks had cracked, small fractures visible only to the careful observer. More would follow. Chapter 4. Rehearsed Lines. The afternoon sun had finally broken through the Devon clouds, casting long, pale rectangles across the polished parquet of the drawing room. The air inside carried the lingering scent of wood smoke from the freshly lit fire, mingling with the sharp bite of furniture wax and the faint, sweet perfume of the hothouse lilies that still stood in their crystal vases. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 3:30, its notes deep and unhurried, as though reminding everyone that time itself was now part of the performance. Hercule Poirot had decided the moment had come to apply pressure. The first act had ended, the second must begin with the testing of scripts. He had requested the entire household gather in the drawing room. Silk curtains drawn halfway to soften the light. Velvet sofas arranged in a loose semicircle. A low table between them bearing a silver tray of strong continental coffee and small crystal glasses of sweet liqueur. The temperature in the room was warm from the fire, yet a chill seemed to cling to the edges, carried in from the open terrace doors. Poirot stood before the assembled cast, a small hands clasped behind his back, egg-shaped head tilted slightly. His green eyes moved slowly from face to face, missing nothing. "Let us speak plainly, mes amis," he began, voice calm and precise. "The calendar stone bears a modern forgery, a death glyph added with clumsy chisel work. Professor Finch noticed this forgery. He was murdered to prevent its exposure. Someone in this room knew what he had seen. Someone acted." He turned first to Lady Beatrice Grantley. She sat very straight in a high-backed chair, upholstered in deep crimson velvet, black silk dress rustling faintly as she shifted. Her lace handkerchief rested in her lap, untouched. "Lady Beatrice," Poirot said gently, "you told me you went to the library shortly after 2:00 because you could not sleep. You discovered the body and screamed. Yet your kid slippers, the ones you wore last night, are quite dry. The terrace outside the library was wet from the rain. One would expect damp soles if you had walked across it in the storm." Beatrice's fingers tightened on the handkerchief. I may have taken the corridor instead. The terrace was cold." "Mais oui, the corridor. Yet the corridor carpet bears no trace of your perfume. Chanel so distinctive, while the terrace doors were open when I examined them. The scent lingered outside. You stepped onto the terrace, madame. Why?" She looked away toward the fire. The flames reflected in her eyes, but no tears came. Poirot moved to Dr. Marcus Bellamy. The epigrapher sat with his legs crossed, tweed jacket unbuttoned, spectacles resting on the table beside an untouched cup of coffee. You claim to have been working in the adjoining study until the scream, Poirot continued. Yet the ink on your desk remained uncapped, the nib still wet when I inspected it this morning. Ink dries in 20 minutes in a warm room. You had not written since before midnight. Where were you, Doctor? Bellamy's hand moved toward his cigarette case, then stopped. He withdrew it slowly. I was thinking. Sometimes one pauses. Pauses, Poirot echoed. And during this pause, perhaps you visited the library. The obsidian blade was taken from the display case in the study. The case shows no sign of forced opening. Only someone familiar with the mechanism could have removed it so cleanly. Bellamy's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. I did not touch the blade. Poirot made a small, expressive gesture with his hands. Rehearsed lines? Our doctor. They flow so smoothly. Yet truth does not need rehearsal. Truth stumbles a little. He turned next to Miss Harriet Voss. She sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, navy cardigan sleeves pulled down over her hands as though to hide them. Her coffee cup trembled faintly in the saucer. You told me the professor promised you co-authorship, Poirot said softly. Then he withdrew the offer. You felt betrayed. You read the Lunar series. You understood the stone better than anyone. Did you perhaps decide to protect your discovery by silencing him? Voss shook her head quickly. No, I loved him. In my way. Love, Poirot murmured. Love can perform as devotion, or as obsession. The coffee you poured for him last night, the cup left on his desk, was laced with a bitter sedative. Not enough to kill, but enough to dull the senses. The autopsy will confirm it. Why sedate a man you loved, mademoiselle? She looked up, eyes wide. I didn't... Poirot did not press further. He moved to Mr. Julian Hargrove. The photographer sat apart, kid gloves folded neatly in his lap, leather camera case at his feet. You developed plates until 1:30, Poirot said, yet the darkroom door was locked from the inside when I checked at 2:15. You had left earlier. Where did you go? Hargrove flexed his gloved fingers once. I stepped out for air. The chemicals. Air, Poirot repeated. On the terrace, perhaps, where the rain had softened the ground. Your shoes show traces of wet soil. Soil that matches the flower beds beside the library windows. You stood outside, monsieur, watching, waiting. Hargrove said nothing. The fire crackled behind him. Finally, Mrs. Eleanor Thorpe, but he had not touched her coffee. Her sandalwood cologne cut sharply through the room's warmth. You spoke of practicality, Poirot said, of money. The calendar stone, properly sold, would restore the family fortune. With your brother gone, the trust falls to you. Did you remove the blade from the case? Did you strike the blow? Thorpe met his gaze steadily. I did not kill my brother, but I will not pretend I mourn him deeply. Poirot drew himself up to his full modest height. Rehearsed lines begin to falter, mes amis. Alibis crack like old varnish. The sedative in the coffee, the dry slippers, the uncapped ink, the wet soil on the shoes, the blade taken without force, each small detail, a missed cue in the performance. He looked slowly around the circle. The fire snapped. A log settled with a soft shower of sparks. Outside, the terrace wind moved the curtains, carrying the chill night air inward. Truth needs no rehearsal, Poirot said quietly. Truth simply is. Lies, however, must be practiced. And practice leaves traces. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Rehearsed lines began to falter. The script was failing. Chapter 5. The mask slips. The drawing room had grown quieter as evening approached. The fire had settled into a steady, low crackle, sending occasional sparks up the chimney like small stars escaping the stage. Outside, the sky had darkened to bruised purple. Rain began again, soft at first, then steady, tapping insistently against the tall windows as though demanding entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of burning logs, cooling coffee, and then the faint bitterness of sweet liqueur, left untouched in crystal glasses. Hercule Poirot had asked that the others leave the room. Only Miss Harriet Voss remained, seated alone on the velvet sofa nearest the fire. Her navy cardigan was buttoned to the throat now, sleeves still pulled down over her hands. The lamplight caught the fine tremor in her fingers when she lifted them to smooth a stray lock of hair. Poirot stood before her, small and neat, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He did not sit. He simply waited, letting the silence stretch until it became its own pressure. "You have been very brave, mademoiselle," he said at last, voice gentle. "You have played the role of the loyal assistant with great conviction. The downcast eyes, the soft voice, the trembling cup of coffee offered to your mentor, usual perfectly rehearsed." Voss looked up, her lips parted, but no sound came. "Yet the mask," Poirot continued, "it grows heavy, does it not? The weight of pretending, the effort of keeping every gesture correct. Truth does not require such effort. Truth simply arrives." He took one step closer. The parquet creaked softly beneath his polished shoe. "Last night, you poured the professor his final cup of coffee. You added a sedative, bitter but not lethal. Enough to dull his senses, slow his reactions. You hoped he would fall asleep at his desk. You hoped the forged glyph would be discovered in the morning by someone else. You hoped your name would appear on the paper after all." Voss shook her head once, sharply. "No." Poirot tilted his egg-shaped head. "No? Then why the sedative, mademoiselle? Why not simply speak to him? Why not demand the credit he promised?" Her breathing quickened. The firelight played across her face, catching the sudden sheen of moisture in her eyes, this time real, not performed. "He laughed at me," she whispered. The words came out small, cracked. "When I asked again about the paper, he said my reading of the lunar series was useful, but the interpretation was his, always his, that I was replaceable." She looked down at her hands. The cardigan sleeves had ridden up slightly. Faint red marks showed where her own nails had dug into her palms earlier. "I didn't want to hurt him," she said. "I only wanted him to sleep, to give me time. I thought, if he woke and saw the glyph exposed, if the forgery was public, he would have to share the discovery. He would have to credit me." Poirot made a sympathetic gesture with his hands. "But he did not sleep. No." Her voice broke completely now. "He woke. He saw me standing there, with the obsidian blade in my hand. I had taken it from the case earlier, telling myself it was just to frighten him, to make him listen. But when he laughed again, when he reached for the telephone to call the police—" She stopped. Her shoulders began to shake, not with the controlled shudder of Lady Beatrice's performance, but with the raw, uneven rhythm of genuine grief and terror. Tears spilled freely. Mascara ran in dark streaks down her cheeks at last. "I didn't mean to," she choked. "The blade, it was so sharp. He turned. I struck, once, and then I placed the stone beside him. To make it look like the curse, like something ancient, not me." Poirot watched her without speaking for a long moment. The rain drummed harder against the glass. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 6. slow and solemn. "You see, mon ami," he said quietly, as though addressing the invisible audience once more, "this is what happens when the mask becomes too tight. The role can no longer contain the feeling beneath. Obsession performs as devotion until the moment it cannot. Then the true face emerges, raw, weeping, human." He stepped forward and placed a clean white handkerchief on the low table before her. She did not take it at once. Instead, she stared at it as though it were an object from another world. "You loved him," Poirot said. "In your way. Love can wear many costumes. Sometimes it dresses as loyalty, sometimes as possession, sometimes as murder." Voss reached out slowly. Her fingers closed around the handkerchief. She pressed it to her face, and the cloth quickly darkened with tears and mascara. "I never wanted this," she whispered through the fabric. "I only wanted to be seen." Poirot nodded once. "The wish to be seen," he murmured. "It drives more tragedies than greed or hatred combined. The little grey cells, they understand this." He turned toward the door. The others waited in the corridor beyond, silent, listening, each one wondering whose mask would fall next. Voss remained seated, shoulders heaving, the handkerchief crumpled in her lap. For the first time since the body had been discovered, someone in this house wept without rehearsal. The mask had fallen. Beneath it, the true face at last. Chapter 6. Behind the curtain. Night had fully claimed Grantley Hall. The rain had eased to a gentle patter against the leaded windows, but the drawing-room remained warm, from the fire that had been fed fresh logs. Flames danced across polished mahogany panelling and velvet upholstery, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move with their own secret purpose. The air carried the rich scent of wood smoke, the faint sweetness of dying lilies, and the sharper note of sandalwood cologne that still clung to Mrs. Thorpe's tweed suit. A single crystal decanter of dry champagne stood on the side table, its contents untouched since the previous evening. Hercule Poirot had drawn the heavy silk curtains fully now, shutting out the dark terrace and the chill night air. He had asked the household to remain assembled once more. This time not for accusation, but for revelation. The cast sat in the same loose semicircle as before, postures stiffer, faces paler in the firelight. Miss Voss occupied the same velvet sofa, but she no longer hid her hands in her sleeves. They rested openly in her lap, red from earlier twisting, handkerchief crumpled beside her. Poirot stood before the low table, small hands making slow, deliberate gestures as he spoke. "Mes amis," he began, "the performance has reached the interval. The masks have begun to slip. Now we step behind the curtain. We look at the backstage, the hidden wires, the forgotten props, the motives rehearsed in darkness." He turned first to Dr. Marcus Bellamy. "You, Doctor, have carried a secret longer than any here. In 1934, on an earlier Yucatan expedition, you authenticated a stela now known to be a clever forgery. The carving was yours, made in a Mexico City workshop and planted for the team to discover. Professor Finch suspected it years ago. He never spoke publicly. But when this calendar stone arrived, bearing your same clumsy death glyph in the same amateur style, he confronted you, privately, in the library, last night." Bellamy's spectacles caught the firelight. He removed them slowly, polishing the lenses with a handkerchief that trembled at last. "I needed the credit," he said quietly. "The stela made my name. Without it, I was nothing." Poirot inclined his head. "Nothing. A word actors fear more than death." Next, Mr. Julian Hargrove. "You, monsieur, have been selling minor pieces from the expedition on the black market for 2 years. Small jade figurines, obsidian mirrors, nothing large enough to notice at first. Professor Finch discovered the missing items when cataloguing the new arrivals. He told you he would report it to the British Museum trustees. You stood outside the library window last night, gloves on, watching, waiting for the sedative to take effect. When it did not, when Miss Voss struck instead, you slipped away. But you left footprints in the wet soil, and one negative, half-burned in the morning-room grate this dawn, shows the blade already in Finch's throat before you claim to have returned to your darkroom. Hargrove flexed his gloved fingers once, then peeled the gloves off slowly. His hands were pale, unmarked. "I needed the money," he said. "Debts, bad investments, I never meant to kill." "Yet you watched," Poirot murmured. "A helpful photographer who photographs murder and burns the evidence." Mrs. Eleanor Thorpe sat very still. "Your brother planned to donate the entire collection to the nation," Poirot continued. "No auction, no private sale. And you argued with him for months. The trust was dwindling. You needed funds. When he died, control passed to you. You removed the jade mask from the study cabinet this morning and hid it behind the drawing-room fireplace bricks, where the police will find it tomorrow. Practicality, madame. Always practicality." Thorpe lifted her chin. "He was squandering our legacy. I protected it." "By murder?" Poirot asked softly. "Or by letting others do the work?" Lady Beatrice Grantley had not spoken. She sat wrapped in a cashmere shawl, the colour of midnight, staring into the fire. "Your grief was performed beautifully," Poirot said. "Yet it was not grief that drove you to the terrace last night. It was rage. Professor Finch had decided to leave you for Miss Voss. He told you so after dinner in the library. You heard the quarrel. You saw Miss Voss leave with the blade already in her hand. You waited on the terrace, in the rain, until it was done. Then you entered, screamed on cue, and fainted, the perfect grieving widow." Beatrice closed her eyes. A single tear, real this time, slid down her cheek. "I loved him," she whispered, "until he stopped loving me." Poirot made a slow circle of the room, shoes clicking softly on the parquet. Behind every curtain, a secret. Behind every secret, a motive. Greed masked as scholarship. Fear masked as composure. Betrayal masked as love. Resentment masked as practicality. Obsession masked as loyalty. Each one of you wore a costume. Each one performed. Yet the body, the little betrayals of the flesh, could not sustain the lie forever. Humans build entire lives on performance, mes amis. We dress our motives in fine fabrics, the scholar's tweed, the widow's silk, the assistant's cardigan. We rehearse the lines society expects. We fear the naked face because it is rarely beautiful, stained with greed, twisted by fear, scarred by love turned sour. Yet the stage is cruel. The spotlight of truth finds every crack. Guilt trembles in the fingers that should be steady. It dries the eyes that should weep. It quickens the breath when calm is required. I am reminded of the Riviera yacht affair, where a woman played the devoted wife so convincingly that the police dismissed her as a suspect. She wept on cue, clutched her pearls, spoke of undying love. Yet when shown her husband's blood-stained cufflink, recovered from the sea, she reached for her champagne flute with fingers that never shook. A truly grieving woman would have dropped the glass, clutched her throat, collapsed. The rehearsed gesture betrays itself in its very perfection. The body cannot lie as smoothly as the tongue. So it is here. The steady hand, the dry handkerchief, the too perfect alibi, the hidden jade, the burned negative, the footprints in wet soil, each a thread pulled from the curtain until the whole backdrop falls. Behind every curtain, a secret. Behind every secret, a motive. Chapter 7. The Final Act. The library of Grantley Hall had been transformed once more. Every electric lamp was extinguished. Only the great crystal chandelier burned above, its hundreds of prisms scattering soft, fractured light across the mahogany desk. The velvet curtains, the Persian rug still bearing the faint dark stain where Professor Finch had fallen. The calendar stone rested in its original place beside the desk, now evidence rather than prop, its carved surface catching the glow like an ancient audience waiting in judgment. A low fire crackled in the grate, sending the scent of wood smoke curling upward to mingle with lingering traces of furniture wax, hothouse lilies, and the sharp copper memory of blood long since cleaned away. The cast had been summoned for the last time. They entered one by one and took their places in a semicircle before the desk, exactly as Poirot had directed. No one spoke. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 9. Each chime rolled through the room like the slow drawing of a final curtain. Hercule Poirot stood in the centre of the stage he had created, small, immaculate, hands clasped loosely before him. His green eyes moved deliberately from face to face. The spotlight of truth, he knew, was about to fall. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice calm, measured, carrying to every corner of the room. "You have each performed for Hercule Poirot. Some with talent, some with desperation, some with genuine feeling hidden beneath layers of costume. But the theatre of crime has one unbreakable rule. Every actor eventually forgets their lines." He made a small, expressive gesture with his hands, drawing their attention to the stone. "Let us review the performances, shall we?" He turned first to Lady Beatrice Grantley. She stood wrapped in midnight cashmere, chin lifted, though her fingers trembled faintly against the silk. "Lady Beatrice, you played the grieving widow with exquisite grace. The faint on cue, the dry handkerchief, the perfect scream. But true grief does not remember to change into dry slippers after walking a rain-soaked terrace. You stood outside the library window. You watched your husband die. You entered only after the deed was done, to claim the role of discoverer. Grief was your costume, madame. Beneath it, relief mingled with rage." Beatrice closed her eyes. No denial came. Poirot moved to Dr. Marcus Bellamy. The epigrapher stood rigid, spectacles removed, hands clasped behind his back to hide the tremor that had finally appeared. "Dr. Bellamy, you performed the outraged colleague, the steady hand reaching for the cigarette case, the scholarly composure, magnifique, until the forgery was revealed. Then the hand should have shaken. It did not, because you already knew the glyph was there. You had chiselled it yourself years ago on another stone. Finch discovered your past deception. He threatened exposure. You removed the obsidian blade from the study case. You waited for the sedative to work. When it failed, you let another take the blame." Bellamy exhaled once, sharply. His shoulders sagged. Poirot turned to Miss Harriet Voss. She sat on the velvet chaise, no longer hiding her hands. Tears had dried on her cheeks. Mascara smudges remained like the last remnants of grease paint. "Miss Voss, your role was the devoted assistant. Betrayed, heartbroken, loyal to the end. You poured the sedative. You took the blade. You struck when he laughed at your claim to credit. Obsession performed as love until it could perform no longer." The mask slipped. The tears were real at last. Voss nodded once, small and broken. Poirot faced Mr. Julian Hargrove. The photographer stood apart, and gloves discarded on the table beside him, camera case abandoned like an old prop. Mr. Hargrove, you played the helpful outsider, the man with the camera who documents everything. Yet you burned a negative this morning, one that captured the moment after the blow, before you claim to have returned to your darkroom. You sold pieces from the collection. Finch knew. You watched from the terrace, waiting to see if the sedative would suffice. When it did not, you let the girl finish what greed had begun. Hargrove looked at the floor. No protest. Finally, Mrs. Eleanor Thorpe. She stood nearest the fire, sandalwood cologne sharp against the wood smoke, tweed suit immaculate. Mrs. Thorpe, you performed practicality itself. The cool sister, the guardian of the trust. You hid the jade mask behind the fireplace bricks, ready to retrieve after the police had gone. With your brother dead, the collection could be sold, the fortune restored. You argued with him that night. You knew of the sedative. You knew of the blade. You waited in the corridor until the scream came. Then you performed duty. Thorpe met his gaze. I protected what was left of our name. Poirot drew himself up to his full modest height. And so we come to our leading performer. He stepped forward until he stood directly before Dr. Bellamy once more. Dr. Marcus Bellamy, you gave the most convincing performance of all. The shock when the forgery was pointed out, the helpful suggestions to the police, the steady hands that never faltered. Magnifique, a scholar above suspicion. Yet you made one small, fatal error. One moment when the mask slipped completely. He paused. The fire snapped. The chandelier tinkled faintly in the draught. When I first showed you the forged glyph on the calendar stone, you reached for your cigarette case. Your fingers did not tremble. Not even a fraction. A man truly shocked, truly surprised, reaches with uncertainty. He fumbles, his hand betrays him. But yours remained rock steady, because you already knew the forgery was there, because you had placed it there long ago, because you had come to the library intending to silence the man who would expose you. Bellamy's head bowed. A sound escaped him. Half sob, half sigh. The performance is over, Poirot said quietly. The curtain falls. The truth takes her bow. He turned to face them all. Every one of you wore a mask. Greed, fear, love turned to obsession. Our resentment dressed as duty. Yet the body, the little betrayals of flesh, could not sustain the lie. The steady hand, the dry eye, the too perfect line, each revealed the actor beneath the role. He made one final gesture, opening both hands as though drawing back the last drape. The final act has concluded. Only truth survives the curtain call. Chapter 8. Curtain Call. The library lights had been turned low. Only the chandelier remained alight, its crystal prisms now dimmed to a soft golden haze that fell across the room like the final glow before the house lights rise. The fire in the grate had burned down to red embers, sending occasional sparks upward with faint, tired pops. The scent of wood smoke lingered heavily, mixed with the fading sweetness of lilies, whose petals had begun to curl at the edges, and the sharp, metallic trace that no amount of polish could entirely erase from the Persian rug. The cast stood in silence after Poirot's revelation. No one moved to leave. No one spoke. The grandfather clock in the hall struck the quarter hour. 9:15, its chimes rolling through the stillness like the slow closing of a heavy velvet curtain. Dr. Marcus Bellamy was the first to break. He stepped forward one pace, then stopped, as though the floor itself had become a boundary he could no longer cross. His tweed jacket hung loosely now. The spectacles he had polished so often lay forgotten on the low table beside the calendar stone. His hands, those famously steady hands, trembled visibly. "I confess," he said. The words came out hoarse, almost inaudible. "The forgery was mine, the blade. I took it intending to use it if the sedative failed. But when I entered the library, she had already struck. I saw the blood. I saw the girl standing there, frozen. I could have stopped it then, called for help. Instead, I left. I let her take the blame." He looked at Miss Voss. She met his gaze without flinching, though fresh tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. "I thought if she were blamed," Bellamy continued, "the forgery would never come to light. My career, my name, would survive." Poirot regarded him without expression. "The performance ends, Doctor. No more lines to speak." Lady Beatrice Grantley drew her cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders. The black silk dress rustled faintly as she moved to stand beside the desk. She placed one hand on the edge of the mahogany, fingers brushing the spot where her husband's head had rested. "I watched from the terrace," she said quietly. "I heard him laugh at her. I heard the blow. I waited until she ran from the room, sobbing, terrified. Then I entered. I arranged the scene a little, placed the stone closer, made it look symbolic, ancient, not human." She looked at Poirot. "I thought if it appeared to be the curse, no one would look further. No one would see my broken heart, or my relief." Her voice cracked on the last word. For the first time since the body was discovered, real grief showed. Raw, unpolished, without rehearsal. Miss Harriet Voss rose slowly from the chaise. She no longer hid her hands. The cardigan sleeves were pushed back. The red marks from her own nails stood out clearly in the lamplight. "I killed him," she said simply. No tremor now, only exhaustion. "The sedative was mine. The blade was in my hand. I struck once because he laughed, because he said I was nothing without him. I placed the stone beside him to make it seem like fate, like something bigger than me." She looked around at the others. "I didn't know you were all watching, waiting, using me." Mr. Julian Hargrove peeled off his remaining glove with slow, deliberate movements. The leather made a soft, final sound as it fell to the floor. "I sold the pieces," he admitted. "Small things at first, then more. Finch found the ledger I kept hidden in the darkroom. He said he would expose me to the trustees. I stood outside the window that night. I saw the girl strike. I photographed it, quickly, from the terrace. Then I burned the negative at dawn. I thought, if she were convicted, the collection would be sealed. No more questions." He looked at Poirot. "I never touched the blade, but I let murder happen. I let it be photographed." Mrs. Eleanor Thorpe remained nearest the fire. She had not moved since the revelation began. Now she lifted her chin, sandalwood cologne still sharp against the dying smoke. "I argued with Alistair that evening," she said. "I told him the collection must be sold. He refused. Said the nation deserved it more than our bank account. When I heard the scream, I waited in the corridor. I entered after Beatrice. I saw the jade mask on the study shelf, worth a fortune. I took it, hid it behind the bricks in the drawing-room fireplace. Practicality, as always." She met Poirot's eyes. "I did not strike the blow, but I welcomed it." Poirot stood motionless in the centre of the room. The chandelier tinkled once as a draught moved through the barely open terrace doors, carrying the chill night air inward. "The masks have fallen," he said quietly. "No more performances, no more roles. Only the naked faces remain, flawed, human, guilty in their different degrees. He turned toward the door. In the corridor beyond, 2 uniformed constables waited, summoned quietly by telephone an hour earlier. The local inspector from Exeter stood with them, notebook in hand. "Lady Beatrice, Mr. Hargrove, Mrs. Thorpe, you will answer for concealment, for tampering with evidence, for profiting from death. Dr. Bellamy, you will answer for intent to murder, for the forgery that set this tragedy in motion. Miss Voss, you will answer for the act itself. No one protested. No one ran. They simply nodded, one by one, as though the weight of the roles they had played had finally become too heavy to carry further. The constables stepped forward. Handcuffs clicked softly, metal against skin, a sound sharper than any champagne cork. Footsteps echoed on the parquet as the group was led away, one after another, into the rain-washed night. Poirot remained alone in the library for a long moment. He touched his magnificent moustache thoughtfully, then arranged 3 small objects on the desk with precision. A fountain pen, a clean handkerchief, an empty ashtray. The fire gave one last crackle and settled into ash. The curtain call had come. No applause followed. Only justice, quiet, methodical, inevitable. No applause for this performance, only justice. Chapter 9. After the show, dawn arrived quietly over Gruntley Hall. The storm had passed entirely during the night. Now pale sunlight filtered through the tall leaded windows, touching the mahogany panelling with soft gold, and turning the crystal chandelier into a constellation of gentle sparkles. The air inside the house felt different, lighter, cleaner, as though the heavy perfumes of lilies and cigar smoke had finally been carried away by the open doors and windows. Only the faint scent of furniture wax remained. Steady and comforting, like the smell of a stage after the sets have been struck. The police had departed shortly after midnight. Dr. Bellamy, Miss Voss, and the others had been taken to Exeter in separate cars, handcuffs glinting briefly under the porch lamps. Lady Beatrice had walked out last, cashmere shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, head high but eyes empty. Mr. Hargrove had carried nothing but his camera case, emptied now of all plates and negatives. Mrs. Thorpe had paused only once, and to look back at the great front door as though seeing the house for the first time. Poirot had remained behind. He had no need to follow. The little grey cells had already completed their work. Now he moved slowly through the rooms, small hands clasped behind his back, footsteps soft on the parquet. The library was empty of its former drama. The calendar stone had been crated and removed to the British Museum under police escort. Its place beside the desk was marked only by a faint rectangle of cleaner carpet where it had stood. The obsidian blade rested in an evidence box somewhere in Exeter. The mahogany desk had been wiped clean, fresh blotters laid out, notebook removed. Yet the room still felt occupied, as though the echoes of last night's final act lingered in the velvet curtains and the low crackle of the newly lit fire. Poirot paused before the fireplace. He bent slightly and retrieved a small fragment of burned photographic negative from among the ashes. Hargrove's last desperate attempt at concealment. He held it to the light for a moment, then placed it carefully on the mantel beside a single hothouse rose that had survived the night. In the drawing room, the silver coffee pot stood cold on the side table. Poirot poured himself a final cup, strong, continental, bitter, and carried it to the terrace doors. Outside, the grass glistened with dew. The air carried the clean smell of wet earth, and distant wood smoke from the estate cottages. He stepped out, shoes clicking softly on the flagstones, and stood looking over the Devon hills. The transformations had already begun. Miss Harriet Voss would face trial, of course, and the charge would be murder, manslaughter at best, if her counsel could prove provocation and lack of premeditation beyond the sedative. Yet prison, Poirot knew, would not be the end of her story. In the weeks following her arrest, she had begun to write, letters at first, then pages of notes on the lunar series she had deciphered. A sympathetic professor at Oxford had already contacted her solicitor, offering to supervise her work from behind bars. When she emerged, years from now perhaps, she would publish under her own name at last. The mask of devoted assistant had been stripped away. What remained was a scholar, scarred but authentic. Lady Beatrice Grantley had not returned to the house after the police station. She had gone instead to a small convent near the coast, asking for temporary sanctuary, and the nuns reported that she spent long hours in the chapel, not praying aloud, but simply sitting in silence. Grief, no longer performed, had become something quieter, more private. The silk gowns and Chanel perfume had been replaced by plain wool and no scent at all. In time, she might take vows, or she might simply stay, finding in the stillness what she had never found in the theatre of marriage. Mr. Julian Hargrove had confessed fully to the black market sales. The trustees of the British Museum had recovered most of the missing pieces. The rest would be traced in time. Hargrove himself faced a shorter sentence: concealment of evidence, handling stolen goods. When released, he would not return to photography. Letters already circulated among his former colleagues. He had applied to teach darkroom technique at a small technical college in the north. The helpful outsider had become, at last, simply a man who developed images for others. Mrs. Eleanor Thorpe remained at Grantley Hall for the present. The trust was frozen pending investigation, but she had begun the paperwork to donate a portion of the remaining collection to the nation, voluntarily, before the courts could order it. Practicality had not vanished. It had merely shifted direction. She walked the corridors each morning with a clipboard, cataloguing what remained, sandalwood cologne still sharp against the wax and wood smoke. One day soon she would leave Devon behind. Where she would go, no one yet knew, not even she. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily, and the velvet curtains had been drawn back fully. Sunlight poured across the parquet in warm pools. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, 10 o'clock, its notes clear and unhurried. Somewhere upstairs, a maid hummed softly while stripping the beds of their last traces of guests. Poirot finished his coffee. He set the cup down on the terrace balustrade with careful precision, then smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from his sleeve. He looked once more over the hills, where mist still clung to the lower slopes like fading stage smoke. The theatre had emptied. The actors had left the building, one by one, in police cars, in silence, in shame, in hope. The roles they had played, widow, scholar, assistant, photographer, sister, had been discarded like old costumes in the wings. What remained were ordinary people, stripped of their masks, or forced to face the plain light of day. Yet the lessons lingered. Every performance teaches something. The steady hand that should tremble, the dry eye that should weep, the too perfect line that should stumble. These are not mere clues, they are warnings. They remind us that the masks we wear, for love, for money, for pride, eventually grow too tight. They crack, they fall. And when they do, what emerges is rarely beautiful. but it is always true. The theatre of Grantley Hall stood quiet now. No more spotlights, no more cues. Only sunlight on polished floors, the soft rustle of curtains in the breeze, and the distant chime of a clock marking ordinary time. The theatre emptied. The lessons remained. Chapter 10. Poirot reviews the performance. Hercule Poirot sat in the familiar comfort of his London flat in Whitehaven Mansions. The afternoon light of early February slanted through the net curtains, falling in soft bars across the polished mahogany table. A small silver pot of tisane steamed gently beside him, its herbal scent mingling with the rich, continental aroma of the coffee he had brewed earlier and set aside to cool. Outside, the city moved with its usual muted rhythm. Distant motor horns, the soft clop of a horse-drawn delivery cart, the occasional chime of Big Ben carried on the chill wind. On the table before him lay the morning newspapers, neatly arranged in symmetrical order. Headlines spoke of the conclusion of the Grantley Hall affair. Archaeologist's murder solved. Forged Mayan stone at heart of tragedy. The photographs showed the calendar stone now safely installed in the British Museum, its false glyph carefully removed by expert restorers. Smaller items noted the guilty pleas entered at Exeter Assizes. Dr. Bellamy for conspiracy and intent to murder, Miss Voss for manslaughter, the others for various charges of concealment and handling stolen antiquities. Sentences had been handed down, none light, yet none without hope of eventual release. Poirot touched his magnificent moustache thoughtfully and sipped the tisane. He allowed himself a small, satisfied sigh. The transformations had continued even after the curtain fell. Miss Harriet Voss, from her cell, had already begun corresponding with the Ashmolean Museum. Her notes on the lunar series, written in careful pencil on prison-issue paper, had been smuggled out by a sympathetic warder and reached a young lecturer who recognized their value. A book was planned, The Lunar Inscriptions of Yucatan, a reassessment. Her name would appear alone on the cover. The assistant had become the authority at last. Lady Beatrice Grantley had not returned to society. She remained at the small convent near Lyme Regis, tending the herb garden and attending vespers in silence. Letters from the Mother Superior spoke of a woman who had found peace in routine. No more silk gowns, no more rehearsed grief, only the quiet rhythm of days measured by bells. Mr. Julian Hargrove taught darkroom technique at a modest polytechnic in Manchester. His students knew him only as Mr. Hargrove, a quiet man who insisted on perfect alignment of enlargers and precise timing of baths. No camera case accompanied him now. He had sold it to pay restitution. Mrs. Eleanor Thorpe had sold Grantley Hall itself, quietly, and to a trust that would turn it into a small museum of Mesoamerican artifacts. She lived now in a modest flat in Kensington, still wearing tweed, still dabbing sandalwood cologne behind her ears. Practicality had not deserted her. It had merely found a narrower stage. Poirot set the tisane cup down with precision and leaned back in his chair. Why do people perform rather than reveal truth, mon ami? Fear, always fear. Fear that the real self is unworthy of applause. Society hands us scripts, widow, scholar, loyal assistant, helpful friend, practical sister, and we learn them by heart. We rehearse the gestures in mirrors, the trembling lip for grief, the steady hand for composure, the downcast eye for devotion. We dress greed in the robes of scholarship, obsession in the costume of love, resentment in the cloak of duty. In naked faces are rarely beautiful. They are stained with greed, twisted by betrayal, scarred by rejection, So we wear masks, we perform, yet guilt is a poor actor. It trembles in the fingers that should be rock steady. It dries the eyes that should weep real tears. It quickens the breath when calm is demanded. The body remembers what the mind rehearses to forget. The little grey cells, they wait, they watch, they notice every missed cue. I am reminded of the case of the disappearing financier on the Orient Express many years ago. Every passenger performed innocence with such conviction that even I, Hercule Poirot, was tested for a moment. A woman played the grieving widow perfectly. Tears on cue, clutching of pearls, voice breaking at exactly the right syllable. Yet when I placed before her the blood-stained cufflink recovered from the snow outside Belgrade, she reached for her champagne flute with fingers that never shook. Not a tremor. A truly grieving woman would have dropped the glass, clutched her throat, collapsed. The rehearsed gesture betrayed itself in its very perfection. The body cannot lie as smoothly as the tongue rehearsed in solitude. So, it was at Grantley Hall. Dr. Bellamy's steady hand when shown the forgery he himself had created. Lady Beatrice's dry handkerchief after a night of supposed horror. Miss Voss's trembling cup that hid a sedative rather than sorrow. Mr. Hargrove's burned negative. Mrs. Thorpe's hidden jade mask. Each a thread pulled loose until the entire curtain fell. The psychology of revelation is simple. Truth needs no rehearsal. It stumbles, it hesitates. It weeps real tears when it must. Lies flow smooth until the spotlight of order and method finds the single false note. Then the performance cracks. The mask slips. The true face emerges, flawed, human, guilty, but at last authentic. Why does truth ultimately triumph over performance? Because no actor can sustain the role forever. The stage is cruel, the lights are bright, the audience, whether police, Poirot, or one's own conscience, never blinks. Every forgotten line, every trembling hand, every dry eye, in a moment that demands tears, pulls another thread from the fabric of deception. Eventually, the costume unravels completely. What remains is not applause, but justice, quiet, methodical, inevitable. Poirot rose slowly. He arranged the newspapers in perfect alignment once more, then walked to the window. Outside, London moved on. Umbrellas opening against a sudden shower, footsteps quick on wet pavements, the distant hoot of a taxi. Life continued its own unscripted performance. He turned back to the room, small hands making one final expressive gesture. Until the next theatre of crime, mes amis, Poirot will be watching.